In this lecture, we want to build a contact app in which we can write people first and last name, build a list of contacts, not yet add phone numbers, okay? Just a list of first and last names, and be able to add contacts and delete contacts all in Vue.js. So as a first step, I created a table contact with a first name and a last name field. In the controllers, I wrote a very simple index that all it does is it passes to the browser, essentially to our index.html, 3 URLs that are signed and that are used for the browser to communicate back to the server. One URL is used to load the contacts, the other one to add a contact, the last one to delete a contact. Okay? I haven't yet written the code that will perform these actions, so these we will be doing together. In index.html, I have an empty place, which is where we will put the Vue code, and I define the URLs in this way. I put into the load contacts URL the content of the Python variable load contacts URL. This way of using the XML constructor, this is a templating language construct, and this way of using XML is used to essentially put this content verbatim without any change between this open and this end quote. Okay, so this essentially has the effect of taking the Python variable that is defined in index in the index controller and putting it in this HTML page that is then delivered to the browser. Okay, so the way it works is that when you serve the index page, you first fill it in with these callbacks URLs and then you deliver it to the browser. Once the page is in the browser, at a later time, the browser will be able to call back to the server using these links. So these are like umbilical cords that will tie the page running in the browser back to the server. Okay, these umbilical cords are defined when the page is still in the server and it's about to be served to the client via the templating language, and will be used once the page is in the browser. Okay, so here we need to put in code that will cause us to display a form for adding new contacts and also the display of the contacts. And in index.js we will put the logic in order to manage the list of contacts. So the logic at this point is empty. I just show you this is a classical starting state that we will be using in any one of our apps. And what we have is essentially that we create an app. We have seen this already in the previous lecture, by the way. We create an app object. It has no data yet. It has no methods yet. This creates the Vue object, okay, with these app data and app methods as data and methods. This is our initialization function that we can call, which right now does nothing, okay. And then we call the init method of this app that essentially gets everything started. Okay. So we call this method that takes the app and initializes it. So at the moment there is really nothing in it. And one way to start, a common way to start, is to write here the templating code in HTML of the effect we want to obtain. So let me write it. So the first thing I want to do is this. I want to write a divider that is used to contain the form to add a contact. And then I want to add below another div, okay, that will contain our contacts list. So this is the other div, and here it closes. Okay, so this is a high-level structure of the page. We may leave a bit more space. Notice this Vue if. This is a Vue directive. It tells Vue, please, this div should be displayed only if this add mode variable is true. This is a Vue variable, so we might as well define it. And so to define it, we go here in the data and we say, sorry, I called it add mode. So I say add mode, and I initialize it to false because initially I just want to display. Okay. So then the variable is defined, and so here I want to display a form that will manage the insertion of a contact, and I cut and paste it in because it's quite large, so I don't want to spend the time typing it. Here it is. It's large, but it's not very complicated. So it's a div of a class form that then contains essentially some other divs, you know, to keep Bulma happy, you know, we want the formatting to be nice. But essentially there are two input fields, one for the first name and the other one for the last name. Okay, they are of class input, they are inputs of class input, again to be keep Bulma happy. The important points are these: they have a vmolded with add first name and vmolded with add last name. This vmodel will keep a real-time correspondence between the content of these input fields and the content of these JavaScript variables that we need to define, add first name and add last name. So let me define them. Add first name, empty initially, add last name, also initially empty. Okay, let's go back here. And then I have two buttons. These input of type submit, I use them to create buttons essentially, that when clicked called two functions. One is add contact, that will take care of the insertion, and the other one is set add status to false. So this set add status, I want to use it in order to toggle back and forth this add mode. Maybe I should have called it set add mode, okay, to false. Let me keep this name. So I need to add these methods. So I say add contact. This maps to app.addContact, which I still have to write. Set add status. This maps to app set add status, which I also still need to add. So let me write them here just above. For instance, I say app.addContact is equal to a function, okay, that for the moment does nothing. Okay, I just want to write it later, but I want to define it so that nothing bad happens. And app.setAddStatus is equal also to a function that gets as input the new status, and the effect is that I want to change this add mode to the new status. So I access that via app.view.addMode, okay, because this is a variable of Vue. You see, it's an app data variable that I fed to Vue here as data, right? So I need to access it in this way, and I set it to new status, and that's actually all I need to do. Okay, so this is actually implemented. The one for adding the form, not yet, so I need to do that. Before writing the code to add a contact, it's actually easier to know how a contact looks like in JavaScript, to write the code we need to display the contacts and to reason about it a little bit. So let me write this code. Again, I cut and paste the HTML code because I don't want to have to retype it all. Here is it. So I build a table with three headers: first name, last name, and an empty header that will be used for deletion. And then I'm assuming that inside the JavaScript I store the contacts in rows. So I will have a variable, let me add it right away. I will have a variable here that is called rows, and initially it's empty. Okay, so I iterate over the rows, and for each row I produce a data containing the row.firstName. I wanted to have the row.lastName. And then I wanted to create a delete button. So I need a delete contact function, which for the moment I don't want to actually implement. So I just write another stub. Okay, I want to, do them one by one. So let me do it. Delete contact, app.delete contact. This I do it to keep Vue happy. And then I can say app delete contact is equal to a function. Okay, actually the function will get some argument, but at the moment I just don't want to bother with it at all, and so I simply say to do. Okay, then I go back here. So this I will describe later how it works, the deletion. Okay, we are not there yet. I want to be able to put some data in, and at the end of the table I put this button that says set add status to true, which is used to add a new person. So you see, when somebody clicks on the add button, the add status will be set to true, and then the form on top that I described before will be displayed. So we know that we have some rows here. Okay, and before I do anything else, before in particular I write the code for adding a contact, let me write the code that fills in these rows based on the content of the database. Okay, so the problem is that so far this index.js initializes a bunch of stuff to empty, etc., but it does not fetch any data, and we need it to be able to fetch the data from the database. So I need to do two things to start. I need to write a function in the controller that is able to give the set of contacts to be displayed. Okay, and I need to write in index.js something that first thing will go fetch these rows and populate them, so that when you load the page it will initially contain those rows. So the first thing we want to do is loading these rows from the server. So you see that app has an init method that is used essentially once you define all the code to initialize the data via possibly a server call. Okay, so here we are gonna put, we use the Axios library to communicate with the server, and so we do an Axios get, which gets data from a URL. The URL, we called it load contacts URL. Okay, so this is your URL to contact, and we are using the promises. Axios is a promise-based library, so we can say once this is done, okay, I specify this function to be called on the response. Okay, and the function will be here. I can say app Vue rows is equal to app.enumerate of response data rows. What is this business? Response data rows will be rows taken from the database server. Okay, so these are rows that will contain the contacts. It will be rows of the database table that will have a first name, last name field and an ID field. This enumerate call will add to each one of these rows an index. This is what enumerate does. It goes over an array and creates an index attribute for each element of the array, so that if you give me an element of the array, I will know quite easily whether that's at index 0, 1, 2. If you will, if I give you an index and an array, it's very easy to fish out the element in a certain position of the array. This underscore index attribute enables me to do the converse. Given an element of the array, I can know at which position the element appears in the array. Okay, I can just look at its index. But this enumerate business, we come to it later. I will explain to you later why I do this. It's a trick that is quite convenient. The important part now is how do I get the rows? How do I write to the controller that gives me the rows in the appropriate way? Okay, so we need to write a controller for this load contacts URL method. So let's go do it. Okay, I need to write a new controller. So here the action has to be load contacts. Action.uses URL signer.verify. Okay, I want to verify the URL, and it also uses the database. Def load contacts. And so the job that I have to do is to produce a list of database rows. So actually that's easy to do. I can say rows is equal to db.contact. Okay, this is a table, and I say select. This will fetch them all. So I'm not checking that you are displaying only your own contacts as a logged in user, right? You can add this logic if you like, but here I'm writing it in a simpler way. I'm essentially disregarding to whom these contacts belong, just to be faster when I develop the example. And not only I generate all the rows, but I generate them as a Python list. Okay? And once I do this, I simply say return a dictionary of rows is equal to rows. I always like to return a dictionary. Let me put a comment here, okay? This is our very first API function. So this is a function that is not supposed to be used by serving a page in itself, but it is used to answer a request from the browser running in the from the JavaScript running in the browser. Okay. I always like to return a dictionary because it makes the data easier to access. We can access it via this response.data, which contains the data that is passed back, .rows. You see, these rows here corresponds exactly to these rows here. Okay, we are returning a dictionary, and the dictionary is now accessible inside the JavaScript in this way. Okay. Notice also that here in action.uses I do not specify an HTML file. The purpose of this function is not to return any HTML. It is simply to answer the request, and this data will be automatically encoded in JSON. Okay, and will be automatically decoded by Axios. JSON is this format of intercompatibility between Python and JavaScript and many other languages as well. Okay, so this will work in a minimal way to fetch the rows into the browser. Okay, so let's test it. So when we test this, I'm testing it in a version of Firefox in which I installed the Vue developer tools. This will make some of the testing quite easy, and it's something that I always like to do. So I can load the page. I've of course already restarted Python Web so that the changes are compiled in. So when I reload the page, that's what I see. There is this sort of semi-ugly initial glitch. Maybe we will eliminate it later, but then I see this. And if I look at the network, I can ask, for instance, to look at various types of calls. And I can focus, for example, on the XHR ones, which are the AJAX calls, so the calls initiated by JavaScript. We can see that there is a call here, maybe I should expand a moment, to a URL that is lecture Vue contacts load contacts. Okay, the status is okay, so this call to the server to load the contacts works. I can look at the request, but there is no parameters, it's just a request to a URL. I can look at the response, and I can see that the response is encoded in JSON. I can look at it raw if I like, or I can look at it beautified, but essentially it tells me that there is an empty set of rows, which is fine, because indeed there are no contacts yet. But this gives me already a lot of information, right? I know that actually my callback to the server works and returns an empty list, and so this is already progress. The other thing I can do is that I can click on the add person button, and then I can cancel, and I can see that this toggling works. And again, this toggling is generated essentially by this add person causes a set add status to true. This set add status function is here. Okay, it's defined on the basis of this function. Okay, so this symbol that occurs in the HTML maps to this actual function here, which sets the app_view add mode to the new status. In turn, this add mode is what drives in the index the display of this entire div here. You know, this div here in this width that is the entire form for adding. Okay, that is why when I click here or click here, this entire form, you know, from here to here is displayed or removed. Okay, so now we need to implement the logic to add a contact. Here we have the two input fields. They are mapped to two JavaScript variables, but now we must actually get this contact and insert it into the database. So we need to get the values of those two variables and send it to the server so that the server can insert it into the database. So let us write the function to add a contact. So what do we need to do? We need to tell the server what is a new contact. So we say axios.post. Okay, and we need to call add the contact URL, but we need to pass it some data, and so we need to pass it a dictionary of data. This dictionary will be encoded automatically in JSON by Axios. Axios is one of those libraries that likes JSON. We have seen already when we read the data from the server that it decodes the JSON for us, and now we will see it will encode this in JSON in a post. So we say first name app_view add first name. Why do I write this? First name is simply the tag by which I'm gonna send the data to the server. Okay, so this is the dictionary key, and app_view add first name is the variable that I already declared that is mapped to the input field. Okay, so this variable will contain the value of the first name as the user typed it, and I'm gonna send it to the server. Last name app_view add last name. Okay, so this does it, and I don't think I need to send anything else. And once this arrives, and is processed by the server. So the issue is this, okay? Every row that I will have from the server has a database ID. But the row I have just inserted, when I insert it, I don't know yet the database ID, because the database ID is assigned when you insert rows into the database. It's then that they receive a new ID. So what I want to do is this. I would like to insert a row in my list of rows, but I want to do it appropriately. I wait until the server has performed the insertion, because in this way I actually know the ID. I will expect the server to be kind enough to tell me the ID. So I say then function response. Okay, and so what I do in the response is that, sorry, I'm struggling a moment with indentation. So what I want to do is this. I want to say app_view rows. So these are my rows, and I want to push an extra element that is a dictionary that is a dictionary that is done in this way. It has an ID that the server I expect has told me. So response data ID. It has a first name that is app_view add first name, and it has a last name which is app_view add the last name. Okay, so essentially I'm adding to my rows a new row that contains the ID that the database tells me after it performed the insertion, and the first and last name that I already know from the form, essentially. Okay, so this will add the correct row, and then what I want to do is that I want to re-enumerate the rows. Okay, I've added a row to the end. You know that I was calling enumerate to give them numbers. I want to redo that to give them new numbers, so that I define also the underscore index element for the row I have added. So I say app.enumerate of app view rows. Okay, and then I call app.resetForm. I haven't written this yet, but I will write it in a moment. This will be simply used to clear the form entries, right? So that if you display the form again, you don't get the old data in it. And then I say app set add status to false, because I want to stop displaying the form. So let me write before I forget this reset form. That's actually easy to write. App reset form is equal to a function, okay, that it just resets the form by setting app view first name to the empty string, and app view last name also to the empty string. Okay, so this should take care of the insertion, except that I haven't written the database function yet. So the database function will receive a first name and a last name, and is expected to give me back in the response the ID. So let us add together this function to add the contact, to insert a contact in the database. And so I say action add contact. Then I say method is equal to post. Okay, because I want this to be called via post. Action.uses URL signer.verify, and also the database. If you forget the database here, it's important. What will happen if you forget the database here is that the changes will not be committed. And so you will send the contacts to the server. The server will process correctly everything you ask it to do, except no new data is then inserted in the database. And it's an error that is very difficult to find, because your code appears completely correct and is completely correct, except that because you have omitted this database from here, you essentially your changes to the database will not be committed, and so will not be saved. It's a very subtle and annoying error. So def add contact. So this is a function that adds it, and I can say id is equal to db.contact.insert. Okay, the insert function of the database returns the ID after the insertion, so we want to save it into ID. So first name is equal, well, I should write it this way actually, with a request JSON get first name. Okay, this fishes out the first name out of the request. You see this first name here is this first name here. When we do the post, we send a dictionary, we send this dictionary here, okay? This first name and last name have the keys in the dictionary, and in index.html, and in the controller, we get these elements from the request JSON. Okay, so that's where it is. That's how the connection is made. Last name is equal to request.json.get of last name. Okay, so this performs the insertion, and now we have to return the ID, and the idea is similar to above. Okay, so we return a dictionary. We always like to return dictionaries, even if we return only one thing in the dictionary, and so we say ID is equal to ID. Okay, So this ID here, which is the key of the dictionary, is what is used in JavaScript here to fish it out of the response. So you see, we send the data to the server, we get a response, and we fish the data back out of the response. That's how the communication works. Okay? So this completes the controller, and we can restart the code and we can test this. So let us try this. I can click on add person, this brings up the form, and I can say Jane Smith. Okay, let me look here what happens before I click on any button. So if I go here, I can go into the Vue mode. Okay, Vue discovers these and it tells me with the data. Jane Smith rows is an empty array. So far everything looks good. I can keep an eye on these and I can keep an eye on the network. Okay, so now let me click on add. Okay, it seems to have worked. Let's look a moment at what went on. So this was the post for the ad. I can look at it. I can see that the request contains the first name Jane, last name Smith, and the response contains the ID is 1. So this was added to the database in position 1. Okay, it's not a bug if you get here a different position. Okay, maybe you played with your database table before. The field is an auto increment, so it starts from 1 only the very first time. We can also look at the Vue controller. I wonder if I could rearrange these fields. Now we see that add first name is still to Jane and add last name is still to Smith, so the form actually hasn't been cleared, which maybe is not optimal. Maybe I should add a command to clear the form. Okay, I thought I did, but I will re-add it. And the database now and the array of rows now contains one row, which is an object. It has index 0 because this is an object in 0th position. You see underscore index tells you the position in the array. The first name is Jane, the ID is 1, the last name is Smith. Okay, so everything seems to have worked, except that there is this slightly ugly factor that I haven't cleared the form. So I should really add these, and to do that I simply go back to my code, to my JavaScript. I had written this reset form function. Oh, and I call it actually. So it's not clear to me why it didn't work. Oh, I see. It's because I was simply distracted. I wrote here first name and I should have written add the first name. It's simply an error. Okay? I was using the wrong names. So with this change I think it should work. I don't need to reload, okay, because this is just JavaScript, so I can actually go right back and give it another try. I can add, I don't know, Jack White as another person. Okay, now I can add it again. This works. Now I have two people in the database, and oops. Oh, because I haven't reloaded the page, of course. Well, how silly I am. Now I can add a third person. Okay, and if I click on add, yes, now it's blank. So now it works. Okay, and you see, by the way, that everything works. So if I reload the page, we can look at what happens. When I reload the page, there is in the network a request to load contacts, and this time in the JSON in the response you can see the 3 contacts. Okay, so at this point we have got an insertion and retrieval of the rows to work, and the portion that is still missing is this delete button, which is actually not very hard to add, but I will show you how to add it nevertheless. So to implement the deletion we do this. The button, I define it to call a function delete contact with a row index. So now finally you will see why the index is used. Okay, and I need to write this delete contact function that can get a row index. So here I have a row index in the arguments, and I write it as follows. I want to know the database ID of the data I'm trying to delete. So I say app vo rows of row index. That is why having the index is so convenient, you know. When I am here in the HTML, I don't really have the row position, because this is the way I loop over rows in Vue. So I have the row, but I don't have the row position in the array of rows. So it's very useful to have this index that I can include in this call to delete contact. In delete contact, I can take the row index and use it to fish out the actual row. And so then here I say .id, because, you know, I want the database ID portion of it. I want to tell the server essentially delete the row that has this ID in the database. And so notice that the ID in the database is in general different from the index. You can see it really well in here. So if you go to the Vue controller, okay, and you examine these entries, you see that these the first element has an index of 0 because arrays begin from 0 but the ID of 1, and so the last element has an ID of 3 but an index of 2, of course. Okay, so the index and the ID in the database are different, and this is a common cause of bugs, people confusing one with the other. So let me go back to the code. So we get the database ID, and then we want to do another server call. Let's do it via get, just for a change. And so we do axios.get. So this is a get call to a delete contact URL. And again, I can pass a dictionary. The only difference is that if in a post, the dictionary is encoded via JSON. And in a get, the dictionary is simply encoded via URL parameters. So I say ID is equal to ID. Actually, let me use a bit less space. So okay, so this is the call, and once the call is done, I can say then this is the function to be used on the response. Okay, and so here is a subtle point. You could have a slow network connection and you could be clicking on these delete buttons very quickly. So I'm not actually sure yet that this row index is still true. It is true at the moment you click on the garbage button, because at that moment that's the index of the row you have in front of your nose. But suppose you click very quickly on 5 garbage buttons. You're gonna do these deletions. These deletions may take time. They may complete in random amounts of time. When the result comes back, you are not sure that your row that contains our third person will still be in position 3, because maybe you have already deleted position 1. So what I want to do is essentially look in my list of rows, the row that used to have the right ID. And so I write this slightly complicated and unpleasant code. I wish there was a better way to do it, but essentially I write for let I is equal to 0, I smaller than app vo rows length I++. Okay, and here I say so if app vo rows of I dot id is equal to the id, so if the row is actually the one I truly intended to delete and for which I send the deletion message to the server, in that case I delete it and I say app vo rows splice I1. Okay, so I splice it, I re-enumerate the rows, app enumerate app vo rows. So every time I change the rows I need to re-enumerate them. Okay, I did it here and I'm doing it here as well, and break because I don't need to do anything else in the loop. Okay, So this is the code, and is slightly, you know, ugly indented, but it's correct. Okay, and at this point all I need to do is that I have index.js that calls this delete contact URL, and I need to write the server portion of this code. Writing the server portion is not very complicated. I can say action delete contact. Method is get, so I don't need to say anything. Action.uses URL signer.verify, of course, and also the database, because again I need to auto commit the result. Def delete contact. Okay, and so what do I do here? I say the ID is equal to request dot params dot get of ID. You see, here is slightly different from what I do. Here I look at request JSON because it's a post, but here it's a get request, and so I can say request params, or I could also say, if I wished, request.vars, but I say params. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I know the ID, and I can say db contact.id is equal to id.delete. So this performs the actual deletion, and I can return, and I just like to return OK. It doesn't matter the string. It could also be return oh, I'm sorry, but you know, you would still have deleted it. This OK is there essentially to help debugging. Okay, so I can save, I can restart, I need to restart, and we can test this code. So let us test this. So now I can click the delete button, for example of Jack White, and it seems to work. Let's look at the network tab. This is a delete contact, and I do a get in which I say delete lecture view contacts, delete contact. There is a signature. Ha, funny, there is no ID. Ha, this is strange. What did the server say? The server didn't say anything, so, but I'm afraid this is null because it's missing. Okay, so 2 errors I made. Assert ID is not none. It would be better to check these. And the other error I made is that I'm sending an empty ID. Okay, and this is because I'm afraid I made a mistake in using the access library. Unfortunately, for a reason I cannot fathom, it's not entirely symmetrical between get and post, and I always forget it. So if you look at the documentation, Axios post uses simply a dictionary, but Axios get, if you need to pass parameters, okay, where is it? Here, it wants these params. So you need to send a dictionary containing a dictionary of parameters. It's really a bit awkward, but there is no other way around. So I instead of doing this, I need to send a params dictionary of parameters. Go figure. But hopefully this will keep it happy. So let me restart the code a moment. Okay, sorry, let me restart so that we have this assertion that will be checked. I reload the page. You see that the data that I thought was deleted is actually not deleted. I try again to delete it. Okay, let's look at the delete contact. Okay, now there is a signature and there is also an ID equal to 2. The response is okay. Hopefully now the data has been deleted. By the way, otherwise the assertion would have failed. So if I now reload, yes, it's indeed gone. Okay, and I can also delete the third person, and even if I reload, it will not appear. So everything works. So this is good. There is there is one last thing I want to do. You see that when I load the page initially, I always have this annoying thing that I see these the template, and only then I see the result. Okay, this is because essentially Vue needs a little bit of time to compile the template and figure out what to do with it. Okay, so when I reload, I see that an annoying flashing. I would like the template to appear only when Vue has taken full control of it, and in order to do that, I do this. So here at the top, I write this style vclock display none. This means that when Vue wants to keep under the hood the template because it's not yet processed, nothing is displayed. And here in the ID of the Vue target, I can say vclock clock. Okay, so if I do this, notice how the loading changes. No more flashing. Okay, there is, yes, a bit of delay in loading the context, but there is no spurious information displayed. All the information is from the beginning under Vue control, and the only delay in displaying the contacts is because the contacts have displayed as a result of this callback. This callback here, app init, that initializes everything. Okay, so this takes a bit of time, but at least there is no spurious information. Of course, what I really wonder is why do we need to bother with it, and why doesn't Vue do it automatically, right? Why do we need to define this additional CSS style and this vclock element? I think it should happen by default, really, but this is the way it was done.